William Law had at one point been a faithful member of the church, even serving in the first presidency. By the spring of 1844, however, Law's relationship with Joseph Smith is fractured and beyond repair. With a singular focus, Law gathers like-minded equals, and together they swear a secret oath to destroy Joseph Smith and save the church. As June of 1844 rolls in, Law has established his own version of the church with himself at the head. He begins a newspaper whose writings are full of libelous material, leading to whispers of violent uprisings against the saints. The Nauvoo City Council has the press destroyed, and within days, as word spreads, nearly the whole state of Illinois has turned on Nauvoo. Fear and panic in Nauvoo spread as fast as the rumors of gathering militias and mobs. War seems inevitable, and the saints will never have enough numbers or weapons to stand their ground. Unable to fight and unwilling to hide again, Joseph and Hiram Smith make a decision they know will claim their lives. I invite you to join us for our discussion of sections 135 and 136 of the Doctrine and Covenants. Welcome to Come Follow Up.
One thing that I've learned from Joseph Smith's life is that I can stand up for what I know is right.
I like how Joseph Smith went and looked for answers. In my life, I like to go and, try to find answers to things and seek and ponder.
Something I've learned from Joseph Smith's life is that I can receive personal revelation if I seek for it.
Something I've learned from Joseph Smith's life is that answers are available to me. I just have to remember to ask.
One thing that I've learned from Joseph Smith's example is that when I pray and I get an answer, I need to rely on it and don't second guess it. And I need to know where the answer came from.
Something I've learned from the example of Joseph Smith is the power in standing by what I believe, even when it's hard and even when other people are going to push back against me for it.
Welcome, everybody, to our discussion on Doctrine and Covenants, sections 135 and 136. My name is Ben Lomu, and I'm your host. Seated next to me is our gospel scholar, Jasmin Gimenez Rappleye. Jasmin creates content on a myriad of Latter-day Saint topics. She graduated from Brigham Young University with a bachelor's degree in ancient Near Eastern studies. Welcome, Jasmin.
Thanks, happy to be here.
And seated next to Jasmin is our special guest, Brother Michael T. Nelson. Brother Nelson was the second counselor in the Young Men General Presidency for the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. He served as a missionary in the Chile Santiago Mission, and he and his wife, Barbara, served as mission leaders in the California San Bernardino Mission. Brother Nelson, welcome.
Great to be here, Ben. Thank you.
We're also joined by our studio audience. Thank you all for being here today. Jasmin, as we jump into these two sections, what sort of background can you provide for us to help us better understand what's going on?
All right, so these two sections cover actually quite a few years. The last chronological section we had was way back in 1843. Now we're jumping over to 1844 with Doctrine and Covenants 135. This is the martyrdom of Joseph Smith and Hiram Smith. It's a eulogy, it's a tribute to the prophet and his brother Hiram. And then leading up to 136, a year after the fact, the saints have been increasingly experiencing persecutions. They had to leave Nauvoo in the middle of the winter, and they end up having to kind of set up a makeshift camp at winter quarters in Nebraska. And they are devastated because they've been experiencing illness and death. And at this low point in their morale, Brigham Young receives this revelation to strengthen the saints, to prepare them for the journey, and to give some practical logistical instructions.
Sounds like there's a lot going on. I'm excited to dive into these sections and talk more about it. Thanks, Jasmin. Our discussions today will be focused on scripture passages within Doctrine and Covenants, sections 135 to 136, and structured around the following study ideas from Come Follow Me. Joseph and Hiram Smith sealed their testimonies with their blood. Joseph Smith was a prophet and witness of Jesus Christ, and I can help accomplish the Lord's will as I follow his counsel. So Jasmin, the first topic we're going to be focusing on is Joseph Smith was a prophet and witness of Jesus Christ. Can we open up to section 135 and look at some of the verses that talk specifically about Joseph being a witness of Christ?
Absolutely. So let's open up to section 135, verse 1. When Joseph went to Carthage to deliver himself up to the pretended requirements of the law, 2 or 3 days previous to his assassination, he said, I am going like a lamb to the slaughter, but I am calm as a summer's morning. I have a conscience void of offense towards God and towards all men. I shall die innocent, and it shall be yet said of me, he was murdered in cold blood. So in this sense, Joseph had kind of a premonition, the sense that this really was the end for him. But nonetheless, even though he knew he was going to his end, he had faith in God, and he knew that what he was doing was for God. He was consecrating it to that end. But it's clear that Joseph Smith did this because he believed that he was doing God's will. He believed he was called of God. He was not going to back down from any of the claims he had made, even though he was in the face of death. He went calmly, serenely, and with a conscience clean towards his ultimate fate because he knew it was in God's hands.
Brother Nelson, how does the story of Joseph's last days strengthen your testimony of the restoration?
Just as Jasmin has said, as I read their testimonies, as they are coming to the conclusion of their lives, that there is nothing that they shied away from. Both Joseph and Hiram and others were willing to lay down and die as a testament of the truthfulness of the gospel that he had been bringing forth and the testimony of Jesus Christ. The more I read of Joseph Smith and his life, the closer I've always come to see Jesus Christ.
Brother Nelson, can you think of a time in your life where you've had to stand up for your testimony and not shy away from it?
Never to the death have I had to stand as a witness, but often. I had been in Chile for 3 weeks and barely could speak the language. My companion was 4 weeks from going home, and he often reminded me of that. One night late, walking back to our home where we were living, came past a man that was out watering the dirt in his yard, in his front yard, which is a custom there. There was a nice fence and a gate around his home, and as we passed by him, in perfect English, he started to denigrate Joseph Smith. I just felt this incredible impression to turn around and go back to his short gate. I turned to him, and in a kind way, the Spirit just poured through me as I bore witness of what I knew Joseph Smith to be as a prophet of God. And I was so grateful for that experience. It carried me through the entire 22 months of the mission, bearing witness of Joseph Smith.
What a beautiful testimony. Thank you for sharing that. I would love to hear from the audience. How has the ministry and witness of Joseph Smith brought you closer to Jesus Christ? Charisse.
I remember on my mission, one of the first times I told someone the story of Joseph Smith's first vision and talking about the light and talking about that visitation of the Savior and Heavenly Father. And I remember finishing that story and then just sitting there for a moment and then all of a sudden just being so overwhelmed that I just said, it's true. Joseph Smith really is a prophet. I'm like, did I know that before? I don't know, but I knew then. I knew in that moment, sharing that experience, sharing that thing that he'd told us and that he'd given to us, I knew. And I go back to that, and I remember that surety and that moment of just absolute clarity and the light that seemed to be just filling my brain and possibly flowing out to say, yes, he is a prophet.
What a beautiful testimony. Thank you, Charisse. Jasmin, in our preparations for this discussion, we had a question that came up that I would love to get your thoughts on. What were the charges that led to Joseph Smith's arrest, and were any of them legitimate?
All right. The charges that were led against Joseph Smith were specifically inciting a riot and treason. But what we have to understand is that this was a conspired plot to assassinate Joseph Smith from the very beginning of 1844. This is coming from multiple fronts, from both dissenters within the church who had left and were upset with Joseph, and people outside of the church who were feeling threatened by the power that Joseph Smith and Nauvoo were gaining politically. And so there was an orchestrated plot from the beginning of the year to see how they could get Joseph Smith killed. You show me the person, I'll tell you the crime. That's exactly what was happening here. So as far as the actual charges, though, when it comes to inciting a riot, Joseph Smith had the Nauvoo Expositor newspaper suppressed. This newspaper published June 7th, 1844, an issue, the first and only issue of the Nauvoo Expositor, which published all sorts of accusations against Joseph Smith and the saints, talking about some of the radical doctrines Joseph Smith was teaching, the dangerous political power he was gaining, his abuses of authority. There's a lot of spin and a lot of exaggeration what was going on. And Joseph Smith saw this as dangerous to the peace and the safety of the saints in Nauvoo, because very similar libelous accusations that were made in newspapers and presses in Missouri ended up leading to a lot of persecution and violence against the saints in Missouri. So in Joseph's mind, this was like a very real threat to the safety of the people. And so they deliberated for multiple days with the Nauvoo City Council over what they were supposed to do, the legality. They end up deciding that the Nauvoo Expositor is a public nuisance in the legal term, so they destroy the press. This sparks complete outrage, and because of that, Joseph Smith and Hiram are charged with inciting a riot because they were so outraged about this suppressing of a press. Long story short, eventually Joseph Smith and Hiram do submit themselves to go to Carthage jail to stand trial. It was a bailable offense of inciting a riot, so they gathered the money to bail them out so they could return to Nauvoo. However, that never happened because as they were in Carthage, they filed another charge against Joseph and Hiram, that of treason. Essentially, as soon as it became clear that Joseph needed to submit himself to the authorities, he was very fearful of the safety of the saints. There was rumors and mob violence and things going around on the outside that was threatening to come to Nauvoo and harm the saints. And so Joseph Smith took the Nauvoo Legion, the militia of their city, and instated martial law so that the militia could protect the city and defend it against any potential violence that could happen while he was gone. From the perspective of outsiders, that looked like he was starting to incite a rebellion, which was not the case, but to an outsider, that's what it looked like. And so they decided to charge him with treason for instituting martial law in Nauvoo. And so as far as if those charges were legitimate, definitely depends who you ask. But I think there's a lot of compelling evidence to say that Joseph Smith and Hiram were acting in good faith on the best legal grounds that they knew how, in the interest of protecting the saints of Nauvoo and keeping the peace in the community at large.
Brother Nelson, you were in the Young Men's General Presidency. I want to talk about and focus on Joseph Smith, the young man, for a minute. What lessons have you learned as you studied the life that he lived as a young man and eventually what he became?
So watching Joseph as a young man gave me confidence that I too could live worthy of revelation. What I had seen and do see in Joseph is a very humble, very teachable, very obedient to what he believes, and was able to receive revelation because of his soft heart, his open mind, very curious. In my view, most of the Doctrine and Covenants that was revealed through Joseph Smith came out of curiosity and question asking. And he was never rebuked for asking questions. And so his openness to ask has taught me, and did even as a young man of Aaronic priesthood age, that we can ask questions. We can ask sincere questions to Heavenly Father, and He will reveal those answers to us in His way and in His time. It seems like Heavenly Father is anxious to answer our questions and maybe even hesitant to tell us things until we do ask.
Right. What a wonderful conversation this has been on our first topic. Joseph Smith was a prophet and witness of Jesus Christ. Thank you both so much for sharing your thoughts with us. And for the audience, thank you as well for sharing. And for you at home, how has the prophet Joseph Smith helped you gain a stronger testimony of Christ? Join our conversation on Facebook or Instagram.
That time I had to accept God's will was, so my first year at girls' camp, I was kind of scared, but I knew this was something He wanted me to do, something He wanted me to experience. So I accepted it.
A great example of, in my life, accepting the Lord's will was going on my own mission, right? I knew that the Lord wanted me to do it, and I always knew that I was going to, but sometimes I didn't feel so excited about it. But when I came to prepare for that more, I felt the Lord helping me to feel more ready, and I'm more excited about doing this. And it was awesome, so worth it.
How I like to receive God's will is I like to pray and see if it's God or me when I get a prompting, and then I just act on it.
A time that I've had to accept God's will was when I was trying to get into college and it wasn't working the way that I had planned it was going to. But in getting my patriarchal blessing, I learned that God has a plan for me and I just need to trust him and things are going to work out.
Let's look at another suggested idea from Come Follow Me. I can help accomplish the Lord's will as I follow his counsel. Jasmin, where in the scripture block do we see this principle?
This comes really into play in section 136. As we've kind of talked about before, this is in the winter of 1847. This is after the saints have been expelled from Nauvoo. They traveled across Iowa, but because they had to leave in the middle of the winter, it was a really hard journey for them. And so they kind of set up camp in winter quarters, which is in Nebraska. And this is a low point for the saints because they have been devastated by disease, by the trauma of being expelled and the death of the prophet, and by exhaustion and exposure to the elements. There's a lot of death among the saints right now. And so they've hit a low point emotionally, morale-wise. And it seems that there's also some falling away of the commandments. People aren't as diligent at keeping the commandments as they used to be before because they're just in despair. And so Brigham Young's answer is we need to spiritually fortify ourselves. So in verses 1 through 4 is where this section begins. It says, "The word and will of the Lord concerning the camp of Israel in their journeyings to the west. Let all the people of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints and those who journey with them be organized into companies with a covenant and promise to keep all the commandments and statutes of the Lord our God. Let the companies be organized with captains of hundreds, captains of 50s, captains of 10s, and a president and his 2 counselors at the head under the direction of the 12 apostles. And this shall be our covenant, that we will walk in all the ordinances of the Lord." So this whole section is about a lot of practical, logistical commandments about how to organize themselves, but ultimately it's got a spiritual foundation because he says, in order to survive, we have to spiritually be ready. We've got to be a promised people. And so he says, this shall be our covenant. We need to covenant that we're going to keep the commandments of the Lord.
Brother Nelson, as we begin to talk about the saints and their journey west, can you tell us a little bit about your experience with Pioneer Trek and maybe some of the lessons you've learned from it?
Sure. Well, we love the youth treks. I think I've been privileged to be on 15 different treks with youth from Wyoming to southern Utah to all different areas.
Wow.
So those experiences are wonderful. They bring alive the journals, the experiences that the early pioneers had. And to Jasmin's comment about this section focusing on organization and how important it is to follow the organizational method, but also the covenant to be obedient, to get along.
Jasmin, in our preparations for this discussion, we had a question that came up that I would love to get your thoughts on. If Zion will eventually be in Missouri, why did the Lord lead the saints even farther away to Utah?
I'm sure that's a question the saints asked themselves many times as they were driven from place to place to place over the course of church history. At the end of the day, it really was persecution that ended up resulting in the saints needing to leave Zion in Missouri and go to Nauvoo, and then leave Nauvoo to go all the way to Utah. Joseph Smith tried over and over again to see if they could find redress, if they could find compensation for their properties that they all lost. And after he went to every single presidential candidate asking if the federal government would help, and they said no, he said, well, I think it's time for us to leave the United States of America, which is kind of crazy for us to think about in today's terms. But if we go to section 136 in verse 22, he makes a reference to the Bible. He says, "I am he who led the children of Israel out of the land of Egypt, and my arm is stretched out in the last days to save my people Israel." So he's referring to how you know, back in the Old Testament, he had the Israelites journey quite a bit. And if it was just about reaching the promised land, the Lord could have done that in a number of ways, and he could have done it really quickly. But instead, he had them wander for 40 years, partly because of their own transgressions, but also partly because it wasn't about getting to the promised land. It was about creating a promised people. He was trying to forge them into the kind of people he needed them to be. And I think the same is true of the Latter-day Saints. It wasn't about the destination. It was about the journey, to be cliche. In verse 31 of section 136, it says, "My people must be tried in all things, that they may be prepared to receive the glory that I have prepared for them, even the glory of Zion. And he that will not bear chastisement is not worthy of my kingdom." And so God really sends people on journeys to create people, the people he needs. I mean, I think about even Zion's camp from earlier on in the Doctrine and Covenants. That was a journey that in all respects seems like it was a failure. They didn't accomplish the goal they set out to do, but the people who were involved end up becoming a lot of the quorum of the 12 apostles. They end up being the leaders of the church. That was the proving ground for creating the people the Lord needed to accomplish his will, and the people who journeyed from Nauvoo to Salt Lake. That was a testing period that created strong saints committed to the Lord.
What specific counsel is the Lord giving the saints before they begin this journey west?
Like I said, there's kind of two sets of kinds of counsel. He's giving a lot of practical counsel for how to organize themselves and a lot of spiritual counsel. And really the two are so connected. So if we go to the scriptures, verses 5 through 10 gives us some of this practical preparation. He starts off talking about how each company in verse 5 will provide themselves with all the teams, wagons, provisions, clothing, and other necessities. And when the companies are organized, let them go with all their might to prepare for those who are to tarry. Let each company with their captains and presidents decide how many can go next spring, and then choose out a sufficient number of able-bodied and expert men to take teams, seeds, farming utensils. And it keeps going on and talking about how they also need to, in verse 8, make sure that each company is attending to the poor, the widows, the fatherless, and the families. And so as it goes through, it's trying to provide some sort of organization for them to be able to efficiently, effectively, and compassionately make it from winter quarters to Salt Lake by making sure they're organized into companies and no one's left behind. Brigham Young was super passionate that your ability to get to Salt Lake should not be dependent on how much money you have. We need to make sure every single person is taken care of and can make it to the valley. But also, this section is full of spiritual counsel, and most of it is just going back to the basics of keeping the commandments. In verses 19 through 26, just to pick a couple here, verse 21, keep yourselves from evil, take the name of the Lord in vain, for I am the Lord your God. Then in verse 23, cease to contend one with another. And 24, cease drunkenness. 25, if thou borrowest of thy neighbor, thou shalt restore that which thou hast borrowed. And it continues on, really going back to those basics of like the 10 Commandments. Do everything you can to be close to the Lord spiritually, because that's the only way we're going to survive physically on this trek.
Brother Nelson, when have you learned the wisdom of following the Lord's guidance and counsel?
We were called to preside over a mission in California, in San Bernardino. Sister Nelson and I were young. She was expecting one of our last 2 children. So we headed off into the mission, very inadequate and overwhelmed. And yet we were taught just to simply follow the brethren, that they know how to lead missions, and that they didn't want some business experienced person to come run the mission, but to come and to follow them. There's 200 missionaries, half of them are in automobiles and the other half are on bicycles, and that's a little overwhelming. My father loved Brigham Young, and so Dad would always remind me to organize in companies. He referred to both Jethro's counsel to Moses and Brigham's counsel from the Lord. That counsel sustained me. We organized in districts and in zones, and it works. And then Joseph Smith says that you teach them correct principles and let them govern themselves.
And the thing about organizing into companies, it's not just like an efficiency, practical thing. It has spiritual meaning as well, because when you are organized into smaller groups, you can have a better way to minister one-on-one to those people who need help. And that's how Zion's built ultimately. We can't build Zion by just relying on the prophet to fix all of our problems. We can only do it if we learn how, as individual members of the church and brothers and sisters, to organize ourselves, take care of ourselves, to make sure that we are creating a Zion society where we are of one heart and one mind.
Right. And Section 136 reminds us that we are under covenant as members of the church to care for each other in that way you just described.
I would love to hear from the audience. When have you followed the Lord's counsel, even though it may have been difficult? Spencer.
This is when I was bringing sacrament to elderly people. I really didn't want to do it that day. I had to get home. I wanted to, go get food, It was a long day. But I eventually volunteered to go, yes, and I'm like, okay, they dragged me out there, and we get to this elderly lady's home. And, she hadn't seen anyone in a long time. And me and my other priest friend, we sit down and, we start talking. And, we ended up talking for a few hours, just really getting to know this person who was this great person. And I was able to give them a service, and I actually felt so much better than probably going home and, eating food and doing whatever. It showed me when I was to follow the Lord's will, it gave me a sense of joy and ended up being for my better.
That's a great experience, Spencer. Thanks so much for sharing that. Brother Nelson, verse 7, we're introduced to this term pioneer. In what ways were you acting as a pioneer as you dealt with all those missionaries and trying to establish a pattern of righteousness among those missionaries?
I learned quickly with the support of my wife. She kept reminding me, just implement what we were taught. And I had no experience. She hadn't served a mission. My mission was 20 years before. Things change. And she just continued to remind me, just follow what we were taught. At least 3 of the brethren had stated that you make or break a mission in the first 3 hours of the day. In our mission, you didn't leave your apartment within the first 3 hours. That's when you left. So everything was about preparation, getting up, nourishing, preparing yourself, your study, your companionship study. All of that is what makes or breaks a mission. That had kind of eroded during that transition of mission leadership. What we did find as they engaged in their personal study, everything changed. They aligned themselves, and back to the quote of Joseph Smith, teach them correct principles and let them govern themselves. We found that when they felt trusted, they were the most trustworthy.
During those times, how did you know the Lord was continually with you?
Well, I think I would consider a personal blessing of having recognized the Spirit in my life. There were times that the Spirit was so clear and so profoundly evident in direction or in decisions. President Nelson reminds us that we need to develop a pattern of revelation.
Well, thank you both so much for sharing your thoughts and experiences. On our second topic, I can help accomplish the Lord's will as I follow His counsel. And for the audience, you've been great. Thank you so much for being here with us today. And for you at home, we still have much to cover in Footnotes. Please stay with us.
The Spirit has felt different to me at different times. When I've needed it, it's been quiet and still. And other times when I have needed to maybe act in a quicker way, it has been stronger and maybe a louder voice to me. And that has helped me through those difficult times.
I feel the Spirit when I make sure that both Lord and I know that I'm looking for an answer and I keep going after it. And then I feel good about some options, or He'll put a thought in my head and those things will stand out to me. And little by little, I end up figuring out what it is that I need.
The Spirit speaks to me mainly through impressions and also through songs. I have a lot of the youth music on my playlist just intermixed in there, and there will be certain songs that I'll turn shuffle on, it'll immediately go to that touches my heart in a way that I needed at that moment.
The Spirit speaks to me in a couple of ways. Sometimes it's just a thought. coming into my head saying, go and do this thing. Other times, it's a joy, an energy and a joy that just fills my heart.
Welcome to Come Follow Up Footnotes. We've dismissed our studio audience and now turn to our deeper dive into Doctrine and Covenants, sections 135 and 136, with Jasmin and Brother Nelson. Well, I'm excited to jump back into these sections with both of you. I feel like we've had a wonderful discussion. Jasmin, I'd love to get back to talking about Joseph Smith for a minute from section 135 and looking at some of the accomplishments of his that are mentioned.
Well, let's jump right into section 135. In verse 3, we've got the list of what Joseph Smith had accomplished. Joseph Smith, the prophet and seer of the Lord, has done more save Jesus only for the salvation of men in this world than any other man that ever lived in it. In the short space of 20 years, he has brought forth the Book of Mormon, which he translated by the gift and power of God, and has been the means of publishing it on 2 continents, has sent the fullness of the everlasting gospel which it contained to the 4 quarters of the earth, has brought forth the revelations and commandments which compose this book of Doctrine and Covenants, and many other wise documents and instructions for the benefit of the children of men, gathered many thousands of the Latter-day Saints, founded a great city, and left a fame and name that cannot be slain. He lived great, and he died great in the eyes of God and his people. And like most of the Lord's anointed in ancient times, has sealed his mission and his works with his own blood. And so is his brother Hiram. In life they were not divided, and in death they were not separated. The list just goes on and on of what he was able to accomplish, but the point is not that he himself did it. The point is that God did it through him. And Joseph Smith was the means and the tool through which God was able to accomplish a great and marvelous work, if you will.
So, Brother Nelson, I want to look at this list, and I'm not trying to, this is one of those like, who's your favorite kid? Because there's some amazing accomplishments that are mentioned here. Are there any that have significant meaning to you in your life with some of the things that Joseph has done? Maybe it's either a revelation or any specifics about the Book of Mormon?
The Book of Mormon would be the favorite child. The Book of Mormon speaks to me in a way that reminds me of what I already know. Somehow I hear pre-earthly lessons taught as I read the Book of Mormon. That transforms my actions because it holds me more true to what I was before coming to this world.
What do you think about this phrase, Joseph Smith, a prophet and seer of the Lord, has done more save Jesus only for the salvation of men in this world? That's a pretty bold statement.
I absolutely believe it's correct. I think Joseph Smith was able to accomplish so much because he needed to lay the foundation for the restoration for everything that came after it. But I think sometimes people can get the wrong impression that we're putting Joseph Smith on the same plane as Jesus Christ, and that's not the case at all. The reality is that we revere what Joseph Smith accomplished because he revealed Jesus Christ to us. He was the means through which we could have Jesus Christ's gospel restored. And so his contribution is, again, being a means to an end for us to get close to Christ.
But if you parallel their lives, you can see that he is a type of Christ, in a sense, based off of some of the experiences he had, correct?
Oh, sure. If we go to the scriptures, section 135, verse 3, he was the prophet and seer of the Lord, which Jesus Christ also was, God's prophet. But in verse 4, he makes a prediction of his death, and it's kind of eerily similar to Jesus Christ. He says that when Joseph went to Carthage to deliver himself, 2 or 3 days previous to his assassination, he said, "I'm going like a lamb to a slaughter. But I'm calm as a summer's morning, having a conscious void of offense towards God and towards all men." This idea that Joseph Smith, died innocent but was a sacrifice to save the saints from further violence, and Jesus Christ was the ultimate paschal lamb, the ultimate sacrifice to save all of humanity from sin, from death, from suffering. Between Joseph Smith and Jesus Christ, you've got 2 men who dedicated their lives to serving God and were able to seal that testimony with their blood. And it's just remarkable.
And there's the betrayal aspect. Christ was betrayed by those who would call his friends, and same with Joseph Smith. They were both betrayed by some that were, William Law was a member of the First Presidency, and he was a huge part of bringing about a lot of these accusations and against Joseph and the church.
And that's a great point to bring up because, yeah, there was a lot of external opposition to the saints, but the kind of opposition that really most immediately led to Joseph Smith's arrest, betrayal, and assassination was the betrayal of his close friends and his close leaders in the church and people who he trusted with his life and had very close confidence with, instead turned their backs on him and led to destruction.
It's possible that some of the internal opposition would break down Zion, while the external opposition often would pull the saints together and strengthen them. And so the challenge was the friendly internal division and opposition.
That's a great point.
And you see that in the Book of Mormon a lot as well, with the varying groups of people. When they're united, whatever is happening on the outside, they can withstand and are strengthened. Whereas it's always the infighting or the struggle that comes from within themselves in the church that really causes the breakdown from those external forces.
And when it comes to the actual specific things that the division was about, a lot of it had to do with some of the radical doctrines that Joseph Smith was introducing at the time. Extreme things in the eyes of 19th century Christianity, the idea that man has such a divine spark and potential that he has the potential to become like our Father in heaven, and even more radical, the idea that God himself may have once been like a man and he has progressed. And so while to us it's just such a hopeful doctrine that we have the potential to become so much greater than we are, and the end of this life is not the end of our progress, but to the 19th century America, that was just absolutely heretical and crazy. And this idea that Joseph Smith was introducing plural marriage was very, very divisive, and that I think even Latter-day Saints can sympathize with, struggling with accepting that doctrine. It can be very trying. And so between those two big things, those were like doctrinal things that tore people apart, but a lot of people disagreed with how Joseph Smith ran the government. They disagreed with how he handled church finances. They disagreed with how he used his authority to do this or that. And so there was a lot of people who saw Joseph Smith as a human, because he was a fallible human, and found a lot of ways to critique and criticize how he was running things. And at the end of the day, Joseph Smith still was the prophet of God, and he was receiving revelation from God. That doesn't mean he did everything perfectly when it came to administration, but it does mean that he needed their sustaining vote, and they let a lot of their own more myopic lenses of how the kingdom of God was working get in the way of God's actual work.
And that may be somewhat of the similarity between Jesus Christ and the church he established, and Joseph Smith, who restored the church, that both had visions of what this would be, what its purpose was. It wasn't just for here and now, both at the time of Jesus Christ and at the time of Joseph Smith reestablishing the church, that this was to be built up for the future, to redeem people, to seal people, to have all the blessings of the temple, and allow people to become what we came to earth to become.
And I think the dissenters didn't necessarily see that full picture.
No.
They see that, oh, I disagree with how he's using the money for that.
Exactly.
I disagree with the way he's calling a person to that in order to do this thing, and they cannot see the long game for it. And that's kind of the purpose of a prophet. He's on the watchtower. He maybe doesn't have better eyesight than the rest of us, but his vantage point allows him to see farther than the vantage point we have, and we have to trust in that.
Brother Nelson, what did you decide that you were always going to follow and sustain God's chosen prophet on the earth?
I was blessed by a grandfather who left Germany when they joined the church to come to Salt Lake at great sacrifice. And growing up, hearing his stories, he always finished anything he would say, "We follow the brethren." And they left much behind in Germany to come to gather to the Salt Lake Valley just prior to World War II. And so I grew up hearing from both his daughter, my mother, and from him, "We follow the brethren." And so that was a family culture that we had. It's been interesting to watch this same mother, now 96 years of age. She is so traditional in her thinking, and yet she still is following the brethren even when there are adaptations and changes that go against her cultural traditional thinking. And yet she still lines right up with it. So I'd have to say to your question, Ben, it was instilled by my mother.
That's great. You know, this is an important thing to understand as we talk about transitioning from Joseph Smith to Brigham Young. What was that process like for the saints, Jasmin? Was it immediately accepted that Brigham Young was going to be the next prophet? How did the saints respond?
The main factions of people who are who believe that they should take over succession and leadership of the church is the Quorum of the 12 Apostles, which is represented by Brigham Young, and Sidney Rigdon. Those are kind of the two big ones. And there are other factions as well, such as there's a person named James Strang who believed that he had the right to succession, and then there were people who believed that Joseph Smith's direct descendants should be the ones to lead the church, such as Joseph's son, Joseph Smith III, and all of those turn into various churches later on. Some of them fizzle out, some of them still exist today. But when it comes to the Quorum of the 12, it's pretty clear, leading up to Joseph's death, that he was putting things in place to prepare that group of people for the succession. In March of 1844, so a few months before he dies, he essentially turns the keys of the church over to them, and he kind of expresses like a relief that I've now turned the keys of the governing of the church over to you. That's a key distinction between the Quorum of the 12 and Sidney Rigdon. They have the keys, and they've received the temple endowment. They've received those sacred ordinances of the temple so that they have the big picture of what God is trying to accomplish here. So Quorum of the 12 assemble again. Sidney Rigdon gets up on a stand and tries to give a speech to convince people that he has a stewardship over the church. And then Brigham Young gets up, and this is where we have this kind of famous folklore story, if you will, where Brigham Young gets up to speak, and the people in the crowd witness some sort of physical manifestation where they feel like he has the mantle of Joseph, where he physically resembles Joseph Smith in that moment, and they know like, oh, this is the prophet. And many people in that moment gain a testimony that the Quorum of the 12 is the rightful inheritor of the church, and they need to be the ones to lead.
Brother Nelson, what's that process like for you when, whether it's in a ward or a stake setting, transitioning from a bishop to a stake president, and then from the prophet, the president of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, how do you go through that transition on a personal level so that you can continually sustain the work that they're performing?
Jasmin has said something that resonates with me to answer that question. The long view. As difficult as it is, new bishop called, new stake president called, new Relief Society president called, there's the tendency to look at the person and to maybe evaluate how will they lead, how well prepared, maybe even a weak moment, how were they called and why? That's not the long view. That's the celestial, here now, management view of how well they'll be. The long view is called by revelation. And that's one of the 13 articles of faith. And that's what we believe in. As I've found in my own life, as I sustain that process of revelation, the witness comes that this is the Lord's call, which helps me then to follow or to at least sustain.
I remember when, you know how we all have our prophet, right?
Yeah.
For me, it was my teenage, early young adult years. It was President Hinckley, and I always referred to him as, that was my prophet. So I remember when, after President Hinckley passed away, and President Monson became the new prophet. And that following April was General Conference. So it'd been a few months. And I'm sitting there watching General Conference with my wife, and all of a sudden, out of the blue, at least for me, my wife says, I just got it. And I remember looking at her and I was like, what are you talking about? She goes, I just got my personal testimony that President Monson is the prophet.
Wow.
And for me, it was such a powerful moment because, well, obviously he's the prophet because, that's how the succession works. And so it was a reminder to me of not letting the process get in the way of the personal revelation, because my wife took the time to have it revealed to her that President Monson is the new prophet and president of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, where I just accepted it. I was like, well, it's just how it works. But it was neat, and I think that's a great lesson to for me to always know that, have that personal testimony, that personal witness that our current prophet is the one who is chosen, or our current bishop, or whatever, leader that I'm looking towards. So, Brother Nelson, as we think about President Nelson, how was that to work and serve with President Nelson? How did having a testimony of him strengthen your testimony of Jesus Christ?
That has been a circular event for me, to have the experience that your wife described. We do. We raise our hand. It's part of the process, of course. They've been prepared. But witnessing and watching the way the Lord runs his church through a called servant who is always looking to the Lord for direction. And I think it's the same in the life of Joseph Smith. They are the greatest followers, in my view, of Jesus Christ. They are perfect in their followership while they lead us. And it's not just an organization that is a business. It's a very well-run organization, but it is the Lord's and is led by a prophet who follows Jesus Christ.
So, Jasmin, I want to get back to section 136, talking about Zion. Sometimes we refer to Zion as a specific place. Sometimes it's an idea. What can you tell us about Zion? What does it look like?
Well, I know a lot of the saints felt like Zion was supposed to be in Missouri, and they felt that because the scripture said that this is going to be Zion, this is going to be where we build our people. But then, as we all know, they get shuffled from place to place until they finally land in Utah. In verse 18 of section 136, it says, Zion shall be redeemed in my own due time. And I think this is a promise that the saints really have to latch on to as they're grappling with the death of the prophet, the expulsion from their homes multiple times, from the death, the disease, the exhaustion, the exposure to the elements that they've faced in winter quarters. It's such a low point that this revelation is kind of that beacon of hope and light for them, that Zion will be redeemed. But it doesn't necessarily explain what that means. Does that mean that we're going back to Missouri someday, or the saints would leave Utah and go to Missouri? I think it's become clear over time that Zion is a much more expansive concept than just a physical place where the saints live. It is wherever the stakes of Zion are, which is in Utah, which is in Argentina, which is in Colorado, and anywhere there's a body of saints that's organized under the direction of the priesthood. That is a stake of Zion, and that's where we can build a Zion people, but it takes work.
So as we're talking about pioneers, I'd love to, what is a pioneer? Because when I was a kid growing up, I'm a first-generation American on both sides of my family. Both my parents came from out of the country. And I remember specifically learning about the pioneers, and I would just turn it off. Because I didn't feel like I related to it at all. I was like, why do I have to learn about pioneers? What is wrong with my mentality? Why was I wrong in thinking that I don't connect with pioneers just because my ancestors didn't cross the plains to get here to Utah?
Well, I've spent the day with you, and there's nothing wrong with your thinking as a friend. As far as pioneers, we envision hand carts, covered wagons. In that 1997 sesquicentennial, there was a couple that was at the lead of the wagon train that went from the beginning to the end into Salt Lake Valley. And she called her father one night and told her how difficult the day was from her cell phone across the track. Told him how difficult this was. And he said, well, you go and get your nice dinner, and then you fix your nice bed in the wagon. And if you want it to be more real, get up and bury your baby in the morning and then do it all over again. And so we dramatize the pioneers. Mm-hmm. They sang and they danced along the way. We know the Martin and the Willie handcart disaster. Brigham Young interrupted General Conference. He learned after the morning session that there were these saints, pioneers, stranded out on the plains. And so they immediately disbanded the second session of conference and organized to go save these groups. So we dramatize the experience. Our youth go on these wonderful conferences, Trek youth conferences. But anyone, my grandparents who left Germany are pioneers. You're a pioneer. Mm-hmm. We're all pioneers because we're building Zion. We're gathering wherever we're taught to gather, and we are building Zion for a day for the return of the Savior Jesus Christ. I feel in my own life an urgency to prepare me and my family in our cultural development of becoming a Zion people, which is the true aspect of what the early pioneers were doing.
Personally, I feel like, your family should enjoy the stories of the pioneers for the same reason that we all should be studying the stories in the Old Testament. I mean, the children of Israel wandered through the wilderness and were their own kind of pioneer, and we look to them as examples because we as Latter-day Saints see ourselves as part of covenant Israel. We've been adopted into the house of Israel, and so we see them as our spiritual ancestors, our forebearers, and so we can draw strength from their stories. And in the same way, the Latter-day Saint pioneers are our spiritual ancestors as well, regardless of where you come from. Once you join the church, you become part of that legacy and you're adopted into this. And like you said, people from all over the world are their own pioneers. On one side of my family, I've got Latter-day Saint pioneers. On the other side of my family, first-generation immigrants. And I see my father's story of miraculously joining the church and immigrating to America as just as miraculous and divine as my mother's side of the story ancestors. But at the same time, the Latter-day Saint pioneers are kind of like the first ones. And so I think we can look to them as those that ancestral lineage of faith that we can hold on to, draw strength from, and at the same time, appreciate the stories that are now global. And I think the church has been doing a really great job to try to make those stories more visible in the histories they're telling, the global histories in the saints' volumes. They're trying to be a lot more expansive in including the histories and pioneers of all sorts of cultures.
Absolutely. And I've since learned that, as I've gotten older and matured and learned about the sacrifices of my parents, specifically my dad leaving his home and never going back when he was 19, with the intent to provide a better life for his posterity. And I look at me and my siblings and everything that we've been able to accomplish because of sacrifices like him and my mom and her family coming from England. And it really does have that pioneer spirit. And I love, Jasmin, what you said about how when you join the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, you are adopted into that family. And so now their history is my history, and I love learning about all the sacrifices that were made so that we can experience the blessings and the joys of the gospel of Jesus Christ today.
Pioneers are always looking forward in physical ways, spiritual ways, in all ways of building a better future for the generations that will follow them.
Brother Nelson, what keeps you on the covenant path?
I'm grateful for the word, the scriptures of past prophets, the words of living prophets, the opportunity to go to the temple and have that long view presented and to see the purpose of our existence here on earth, to be able to be reminded of my covenant responsibility and privilege.
Well, it's been such a joy to get to know you and to hear your experiences and to feel of your spirit and your testimony, Brother Nelson. Thanks so much for being here with us today.
Thank you. It's been a privilege.
And Jasmin, you've been great as always. Thanks for sharing so much of the historical context and getting us into the scriptures and sharing your wealth of knowledge with us.
Well, thanks for having me. This is always so fun.
And for those watching at home, thank you for joining us for this discussion from Doctrine and Covenants, sections 135 through 136. In addition to weekly episodes, we offer clips, quotes, illustrations, and more, available anytime for free at BYUtv.org or through any of our social media channels. Please join us next week as we study Doctrine and Covenants, sections 137 through 138. Thank you for watching.